We'll move on to our second talk for this session, which will be given by Dr. Andrew Tweel, environmental scientist at Marine Resources Division of South Carolina DNR, and he will share with us about the Port Royal Sound Watershed and its land use.
Thank you, Chris. Can you hear me all right?
Yes.
All right. Good morning, everybody. I'm going to give a little bit of overview on Port Royal Sound Watershed as a whole, some of the land use within the watershed, and how some of that interacts with the adjacent marine systems. I'd like to acknowledge the Port Royal Sound Foundation in supporting this work. So here's just kind of the watershed as a whole. Watershed reaches 70 miles inland, containing parts of 5 counties. The watershed originates near Allendale, South Carolina, with the Pocataligo River, and also includes the Caloosahatchee River as its primary 2 drainages at the top of the estuary. Compared to other estuaries in South Carolina, freshwater input's relatively low and salinity is generally high. I-95 serves as an approximate dividing line for several reasons, both geographic, which I'll review in the subsequent slides, and regulatory, which approximately serves as the legal saltwater freshwater dividing line that is Highway 17, which is largely shared with I-95 for this portion of the watershed. So above this line, the upper watershed is distinct in its abundance of agriculture. So 97% of what's classified as agricultural land use, and this metric does include forestry in that category, which is a predominant practice in that portion, occurs above I-95. This boundary also demarks the upper extent of estuarine wetlands, or salt marsh, as the previous presenter illustrated. And so 99% of the coastal and estuarine wetlands occur south of that boundary in the southern zone. The adjacent estuary contains the highest tide range along the South Carolina coast. The other main distinguishing characteristic between these parts of the watershed, of course, is that the vast majority of urbanization in the last 2 decades has occurred below this line. So in terms of the total urbanization change, 87% of that change has occurred below this line for the period between 2001 and 2019. So for the remainder of this talk, I'll focus on the coastal portion of the Port Royal Sound watershed, where land use and the marine landscape are more tightly coupled. So let's zoom in on that and we'll take a closer look. So I'll start here just from a visual perspective. So we can look at satellite imagery going back to 1984 and extending to 2020. The dominant visual change is a shift from a forested and undeveloped landscape to suburban and commercial areas, particularly in the Bluffton area along Highway 278 and 170. Through the next series of slides, we'll take a closer look at some of these same changes here and elsewhere through the lens of various data layers and explore more about what that all means. So before I do that, let's just take away everything else for a second. This is just kind of the plain landscape here, and you can see the water shown there. So this really is a landscape shaped and defined by water. 20% of that lower portion is covered by open water. Add in wetlands, and that is salt marsh, freshwater wetlands, and swamps, which are forested wetlands. 60% of the landscape is submerged at some point. Many of these wetlands and swamps occur in small pockets and patches as isolated wetlands or complex shorelines. So on average, from any point in the lower watershed, you're just over 100 yards from any one of these wetland areas. The farthest you would have to walk from anywhere in this portion is just over a half mile. So these wetlands are really an invaluable part of the landscape, providing everything from water quality benefits, wildlife habitat, absorbing wave energy, and of course, their natural intrinsic beauty. So along with the incredible coastal marsh landscape, there has been an increase in population. In all of my slides, the darker colors shown will represent more of what is being shown, and the lighter colors will represent lower values. So in terms of population density, and these data are from the 2010 census, which is the most recent tract level spatial data currently available, we see a fairly patchy distribution of population. There's 3 main population areas: Beaufort Port Royal area, Bluffton, and Hilton Head Island. Beaufort County grew 15% since the 2010 census, and the population of Bluffton has more than doubled over that same time. These population centers are generally characterized by higher rates of impervious cover, and impervious cover is things like parking lots, rooftops, and roadways, which direct stormwater across the land surface rather than allowing infiltration into the soil and eventually the groundwater. This runoff can carry contaminants such as fecal coliform bacteria, fertilizers and pesticides, as well as oil residues and tire wear particles from the road surface. So here's a little schematic, and I'll give some examples of how the addition of this impervious cover can alter the hydrology of the landscape, including the adjacent coastal waters. So here we see a natural or forested watershed, rainfall coming down, which is largely able to infiltrate into the groundwater. You also have loss through evaporation and plant transpiration, which is the uptake of water by plants. What runoff does occur is typically low. And as you can see in this diagram, the flow over time is low, and the total volume of runoff is relatively low. And the runoff is captured and filtered by the vegetation on the landscape as well. Now we move to our developed watershed. There are a variety of surfaces present that impede this infiltration, plus usually less vegetation to capture and slow the runoff. So the end result is that more of the water that would have infiltrated is directed across the landscape. This leads to more water entering the adjacent landscapes. You can see that much larger area there showing the stormwater runoff in that example. And also more rapid runoff. So you have more volume and that volume is occurring over a shorter period of time. And you can see that demonstrated in this chart here on the right. And so also, one effect we've observed in our research is that tidal creek salinity, so salinity in the adjacent coastal system, can fluctuate dramatically in these developed systems. We're still exploring potential biological impacts from this effect. But you can see here in the graph that the peak flow is much higher and the total volume is greater. So now let's look a little bit more deeply at the combination of the natural and the human landscape. Here we have our wetlands map back up, and that's in green. And you can see all the high ground then remaining there in white. Now, adding back on a layer, this is another way of showing kind of human presence and development, and this is a map of impervious cover. So the darker colors, again, indicate pixels with a greater coverage of that pixel being covered by impervious surfaces. Again, this is things like parking lots, driveways, rooftops, things that don't allow infiltration and direct the flow of stormwater into the adjacent landscape. So in 2001, just over 4% of the upland areas in this lower portion were covered by these surfaces. By 2019, this area is over 6%. So I'll toggle back and forth just a few times so you can see the areas that have changed over that time period. Along with this development, particularly the newer development, has come the construction of stormwater ponds, also known as detention basins. These ponds are considered a best management practice intended to offset, capture, and slow down the impacts from impervious cover that I mentioned previously. And so this is a data set we digitized back in 2015 of all ponds across the coastal counties of South Carolina. So if you think back to my diagram, where I showed the increased volume and more rapid rate of runoff, these ponds are designed to mimic some of the runoff characteristics in the more natural landscape. So trapping the water and slowing down its flow across the landscape. In some areas, however, such as Hilton Head, some of these ponds were constructed prior to the regulatory framework that was enacted in the 90s and were dug more as an amenity or sources of fill material. These types of ponds were not necessarily designed to receive and slow this runoff. So combined with the impervious cover that I've shown, now that we have this landscape of ponds, the net result is a landscape of altered hydrology. We have more surface water present and more water being directed into the estuary that would have otherwise infiltrated. So just a couple of quick stats. In this clip here, there are 1,900 ponds in the lower zone as of 2015. And if you add up the area of all those, you have 5 square miles of new surface water. So up to now, I've spoken about the watershed as a whole, and then I've distinguished between the upper and lower portions. Now I'd like to dive a little bit deeper and look at some of these same watershed patterns, but at a smaller scale. So if you think about the watershed as a whole, you can think about its drainage patterns. And then if you look at the smaller systems, each with their own drainage and land use characteristics. And then within each of those has smaller watersheds and so on. So just a couple examples here. These are 3 watersheds that I've chosen to just as examples. For example, the impervious cover within these watersheds ranges from 1 to 15%. So you have the Uhaw Creek there. The northernmost one is fairly rural and largely undeveloped. Battery Creek in the middle and on the right is an urban tidal creek developed largely prior to the implementation of best management practices. And then the Okatee or Colleton River, also highly developed there, but was largely developed after stormwater BMP implementation. Much of the development in this watershed, however, is in the headwaters of this system, which represents the primary interface between the upland and marine systems, which are the receiving body for this runoff. So now I'm zooming in here a little bit closer to the Okatee-Colleton River watershed again. So you can see it flowing east into the Chichessie and ultimately the Broad River. This watershed contains the intersection of Highway 270 and 178, as well as the Sun City development. Smaller drainages within this area are known as headwater tidal creeks. I've delineated those with these thick black lines that you can see there. So I showed the watershed as a whole, which is about 6%. Some examples of large creek systems that range from about 1 to 14%. And then these smaller systems, if you look at their watersheds, range up to 25%, just in this example. You can find many more examples of these throughout the watershed with a wide variety. The idea is that this can vary widely across the watershed and landscape. These smallest creeks serve as a primary interface between the uplands and coastal systems, the primary receiving body of these stormwater inputs. And these areas are often considered the most sensitive in terms of signs of development in the estuary, which the next talk will discuss in greater detail. So now one more layer, zooming kind of back out to the lower watershed view. And I've also added the bathymetry or depth layer, which is the gradient in blue. So the darker colors show much deeper areas. This is an estuary, like I said, with the largest tides in the state. And it's also quite deep relative to many other estuaries in this region. The watershed, as I mentioned, is also developing quite rapidly. And these several characteristics, I think, combine to really set it apart in a number of ways, as you'll see in the following talks today. So I think going forward, for me at least, some of the most critical questions relate to how the increasing population, both on the water and on land, will shape the sound and these important habitats going forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew, for that great overview. Just looking to see if there are any questions for Andrew. There's so much information there. I really think it was informative to break down the watershed into 2 parts and to see that a lot is happening in the lower section, but to remind everyone that the upper section also drains into the Port Royal Sound, and that at present continues to function the way that Andrew described in terms of being a forested system where the watershed works in the appropriate way. And one of the questions that has come up is, can you mention the sub-watersheds that are most impacted based on your work?
So Denise will talk about a little bit about that next. We have not surveyed every single sub-watershed. We've selected generally a suite of watersheds that represent an array of conditions. So I think some of the ones that I mentioned, the Okatee headwaters is one of the higher areas. The Battery Creek headwaters is one of the higher areas, but we've not done a comprehensive survey of every single sub-watershed.
Okay, a second question is, what is the effect or what are the data on loss of treetop canopy on the estuary? You may not have looked at that specifically, but are you able to do that with GIS?
You can, yeah. So some of those data layers I showed have, I think, 25 or 26 different land cover classes that you can explore. And one of those cover classes is whether or not the landscape is forested. So that is something that we could look into. As far as the effects on the landscape, so the schematic that I showed showed evapotranspiration. So that is an important process of water cycling in the estuary. So without trees, you have lower evapotranspiration, so you'd have greater potential for stormwater, or less potential for stormwater or water uptake in that sense. Trees, of course, also provide shade and kind of keep a cooler landscape as well.
So one of your diagrams showed that basically, if you're thinking about the water cycle in a forested landscape, it indicated that much of the water actually goes back up into the atmosphere before it, rather than becoming runoff into or groundwater infiltrating the tidal creeks. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, very good. Well, with that, thank you again, Andrew. That was a great overview.